Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm very sorry. I'm just sick. I will try my best. I thought it was important to start with the discussion this morning, responding to the remaining questions, and then as Dr. Ray was not here, to be able to go through the whole discussion. Well, I think we still have a great deal of work to do in that field. And you will understand where I'm coming from. Always inductively going back to the big picture and coming back down to the practical issues. But I want to do this dialectical process between what we have, how do we have to understand the big picture, coming back to the practical questions. So when it comes to the human rights, there are things that we need to get in the discussion. It's quite a contemporary discussion that we have about human rights. And it's true that if you look at the literature in the West, the starting point of this discussion about human rights started in the United States and not in France, as the French people are claiming. Everything came after the French Revolution, which is not true. You already had, and in fact, people like Voltaire and Rousseau were influenced by things that were coming through Hume, coming from the American bill, and I think that this is also something which is important. You had all the production coming on the 18th century, Enlightenment, which is also very important, connecting human rights with the rise of rationality in the West. That's a very important point. And rights and rationality are also critical in this discussion because this is where we have to come to this. And then after the Second World War, all the discussion about the human rights and setting something which is an international charter, an international declaration, a universal declaration, based on what? On something which is essential when it comes to universality. And I tackled this discussion in the book, The Quest for Meaning, saying, from where comes the universal? Is it coming from, it's a top-down process coming, it's a relation, this is the way we think about it, are constructed through our common rationality. So which is the discussion we have about morality and ethics in the Western tradition. Ethics being understood as a construction through our common rationality, and morality being revealed. Which, by the way, it's not always the case, because in the Weber tradition you also have something which is ethics coming from a religious background. That's the point is for me here to say that what we had with the human rights discussion was mainly in the 20th century saying it's a universal declaration by the fact that our common rationality is going to agree on it. Okay, we agree on that. And the first thing that we heard is, yes, the world was involved. The whole world was involved through the United Nations and the Society of Nations, and then the United Nations. All the world was involved, and still what we had, and this is also quite interesting, is to listen to the critical voices that we had at the time. That's also very important. And mainly we had three main criticisms. The first was a religious reaction, saying, if it's coming from and through the common rationality, how are we going to deal with God? God comes first. So you have Catholics and Jews, for example. We had a very interesting discussion, this was 30 years ago, in interfaith dialogue with a Jewish intellectual. He was the leader of the European Jewish intellectuals, the Society of the European Jewish Intellectuals, saying, in fact, everything which is in the Universal Declaration is already in religions, and we have it in the Jewish tradition already. So saying, what you bring from a bottom-up construction was already there in the top-down, from on-high revelation. So everything is there. And you have Catholics who said exactly the same, and you had position saying, in fact, there is no contradiction, or there are contradictions. You had people saying there is no contradiction, and some saying there are contradictions. So you have religious voices questioning one fundamental question, which is what is the source? God or the human being as producing something which is common? And they put an interesting question that we have to, and we keep in mind, is what if you believe on human rights coming from God and I don't believe in God? So what is the universality of what you are saying? The source is not the source that I acknowledge. Can't we come and start the discussion with something on which we agree, which is our common rationality? Can we do something out of this? That's a fair question. You cannot just dismiss the point. You have to listen to this. Which, by the way, it's interesting for Muslims because we are not scared from rationality. In the Western tradition, rationality and religion were intentions. By the way, we are used to say that they were not intention in Islam, which, it should not have been intention, but it was sometimes. Of course it was. To the point of when we speak about our sources and when we speak about our methodologies, that's the discussion that we have now. There is something which is a tension here. Is it a rational or a traditional response that you have about the way that you can be, the limits of your critique towards the tradition? That's an important question here. So you had the first set of critiques coming from the religious voices saying the source is problematic. You had another set of questions, mainly coming from Asian traditions, which was very important, and also indigenous, the Native Americans, when they heard about this. And one of the voices, because it was written in the 30s and the 40s, at the beginning of drafting and writing, you remember Gandhi? He got the draft before it was going to be. And he said he took months before responding. And he had a very simple answer, but a very important one for us. When he was saying, I got the draft about the human rights, but my mother taught me that with every single right you have, there is a duty. Saying that the problem with what you are writing is the philosophy of rights not based on an understanding of the duty. Which, by the way, is very important because the consequences of human rights in all the culture of rights that we have in democratic societies now, it's a problem. It's a problem. Is how do you define citizenship? Citizenship cannot be only a set of rights towards the community. It has to be and has to do with responsibilities, if not duties, collective duties. And he had the point here is what you are trying to get out of the catastrophe we went through during the Second World War is just to protect human beings through the rights they have, not the duty they should get. Which from an Islamic perspective, what he is questioning here is not the source, is the substance. Second type of critique. The third is coming from Latin American countries, mainly liberation theology, but also people who are resisting in Latin America. You had them in Peru, you had them in Brazil, you had them in Argentina saying, that's completely wrong. You cannot speak about human rights if you don't speak about the rights of the people. You cannot extract one and not understand that this is not going to work if you don't have the right of the people. Because at the end of the day, if you speak about one and you don't speak about the society, the right of, for example, autonomy, you can protect the right of one and not respect the right of all. Which in fact it's coming from, this is very much a Western way of dealing with it. You come, you colonize, you tell us about the right of one and you forget the right of all. Interesting, very interesting. And it's very right from our perspective. So I would say that the three types of critiques were very interesting from an Islamic viewpoint. And then there is something which was a reaction coming from the Muslims in 81 first, is the Muslim European Council, Salim Azzam. He was one of the first, and they tried to have this. So it was produced by European Muslims, but connected, of course, with Muslim majority countries, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, where they produced the Islamic Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you listen to this, there is a problem even in the way you are reading it. The Islamic Universal Declaration. So is it Islamic or is it universal, or are you implying that because it's Islamic it's universal, so what about the other? So of course, as Muslims we think it's universal. But how are you going to deal with the people if you put Islamic? While in some of the articles in the Islamic Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have at the end of articles, according to Sharia. So the point is, what do you mean? What is Sharia? Which type of Sharia are you mentioning? And in fact, this also started with all what was happening with the Iranian revolutions and all this business with violence is, if Sharia is the penal code, so in fact, referring to Sharia, it's a problem per se. So you are referring to a universal document to something which is beyond the document itself. How come? It should be self-sufficient. If it's a universal declaration, it should be self-sufficient. You cannot just bring the people by saying it has to, and then you have interpretations about the source. That's a problem. But we had that, and you had many who wrote on this, which also was important. With time, also, we need to add some other critiques that were very important. One was about, when we speak about human rights, are we speaking about women's rights? So some were saying we need to have the human rights of women. Okay, saying there is something specific. Some of the feminists were saying this. They say it's not enough. So because if you deal with equality, equality is not to have exactly the same rights. In some patriarchal society, you have to deal with something which is bigger than that. So you have to have this. It didn't succeed, even though you have some philosophers. One of them is the one with whom I am writing a book now, who is saying the big mistake of the human rights is not to have integrated women's rights. It's disputable, because even if you read the Universal Declaration, there is something which is clearly integrating the women as a human being, and then we are not differentiating. Now, do we have to differentiate, or do we have just to take it as something which is important? Inclusive. This is one. The second is what was added with time. I don't know if you followed that, but this is something which is very important. To speak about human rights is not enough. You have the children's rights. The Declaration of Children's Rights is not exactly the same. So, mind you, the discussion that we had about age here. So when are you autonomous? And who decides? So between the two here, there is a big discussion. At least a critical discussion that you cannot just dismiss by saying it's not, it's all the same. If you look, for example, at, it's not only the age of marriage, it's just the age of working. So what comes first? The right to work, to survive, or the need to be educated, to be a human being? What if the first takes over the second? Which at the end, you took my dignity in the name of your work, not my education. Children's rights. Do we have something coming from an Islamic perspective on this? Check. That's a problem. That's a problem. The very essence of thinking about children, and beyond, the natural thing that you say, when you look at your father, you say, the right that you have on your father is to have the good mother, and the right that you have on your mother is to have the good father. That's fine, that's nice. It's not going to solve the problem in the society. So here we have something which was produced and it was criticized. The problem is that very often Muslims, when they enter into the discussion, they go straight to the dominant discussion and they try to show that it's compatible or not understanding the dynamics within the historical dimension. So I just let us tell them that we have no problem with human rights. Yes, we have. Of course we have problems. And not where they think that we have a problem. It's something which is deeper than that and at the same time it's more critical, that we have to be both critical towards our own tradition in the way we were dealing with our legal system, and then at the same time towards the Western tradition telling us what we produce is universal, you have no choice. So you are put in a situation where you are accused if you not abide by what was called universal and was criticized from the very beginning by people. And they would quote Gandhi, but not on this. Gandhi is fine, but not on that. So in these selective, quotations that we have. And then what came out of this is something that we have to deal with, because I would put this as a postulate. But I want you also to think about this, is that the fact that we have human rights and the fact that you have the dominant culture, in fact, the way we are dealing with human rights is very often avoiding us to come with this understanding of human rights and to be critical about the economic order. The culture of rights, and only rights, when it comes to us, our societies, and the social dynamics, is problematic. The culture of rights. Because at the end, even if you look at the free market in economic terms, it's very much about that. It's exactly the same mindset. So you can see that it's mirroring. You can have at the same time liberal democracy on human rights and liberal economy with free market. Both are working against each other, but the two rhetorics are working together because it's the same terminology. And it focuses on your rights as a human being, not as what the Latin American people were saying. We need to talk about people. We need to talk about autonomy. And this is where you are critical towards the global economy when it comes also not only to the individuals, but the nations, where in fact you might say we respect the people, but you don't respect the nations. You don't respect the collective process. So we need to deal with this, and I would suggest that as much as we should respect human rights and enter into the discussion, we should not stop being critical about the whole notion and the whole comprehensive approach. Now, last point of my introduction is that there is one approach that is common now, and especially among the Western scholars and the Western Muslim scholars, but not only. In fact, that's not true. You find it also, you have two positions. One is saying, in the name of our religion, it's coming from the Salafi very often, we don't care. That's not us. There's nothing like human rights in Islam, and there are articles we disagree with, so we don't enter into this. Or to say the opposite. We don't have a problem with them and we agree with them. Or in between, Salim Al-Awa, saying we have two problems. One is about the marriage, the age of marriage, and the other one is about changing your religion. And this was the position of the scholars. By the way, once again, even in Islam about this, we have a problem. Man baddala dinahu faqtuluh. How do you understand this? And you have many views on this. But he was saying that mainly what we have from an Islamic perspective is we don't have a problem with the whole thing, but we have problems with some articles. And this is, in fact, what was produced in 81, was saying exactly the same and saying, in fact, we have three problems, with some articles and with the ultimate reference. The ultimate reference is Sharia, means is God. It's not our common rationality. Is that enough? I think it's not. And it's a problem, because we don't get the substance or the critical essence of what we need to deal with. So I would suggest, and also I will integrate the Maqasidi approach in what I'm saying here, is if we are serious about anything which has to do with human rights, I would even suggest that what we have to produce is much more demanding than the Human Rights Declaration that we have today. It's much more demanding. In fact, it's the other way around. It's demanding and we try to catch up. It's our philosophy of life is much more demanding than the human rights and the philosophy of rights that you have. It's much more demanding than that. Starting with what? The three main dimensions that we have, that I keep on repeating in all the books. If you start the books that I started writing in the beginning of the 90s, I keep on repeating always the same, which is the three main dimensions that we have. First, At-Tawheed. He is the source. Al-Khilafa, we are the vice regions on earth. And the third, Al-Mas'uliyah. Al-Mas'uliyah is responsibility. And we have a responsibility as the Khulafa that we need here to understand that it's a concept of human being which is essential when it comes to Allah is what are the four main principles or notions that we will get, that we find in the Quran that are connected to al-Tawheed, al-Khilafah, wal-Mas'uliyah. The first, which is essential, is with Allah that He has the ownership. He is the owner, huwa al-Khaliq. So in our understanding, by the very essence, the very understanding of being khulafa, before having rights, we have to acknowledge that He has the ownership. So we have duties. The whole thing is, I have a responsibility. And my election, and this is why some Muslims should be very, very cautious when they are very quick to criticize the Jews by saying, you know what, they think that they are the chosen people. Yes, they were the chosen people. فَضَّلَكُمْ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. They were. But based on what? Based on your blood? This is shirk. Based on your tribes? This is shirk. Based on the fact that you have a responsibility to serve humanity in the name of truth. Your responsibility is to serve, not to pretend that you are better. The point here, al-Khulafa, means that our understanding of Tawheed means that the whole perception, that the very essence of He is the owner, is something which is making us understanding our duties first. That we are the guardian of what He gave us as a trust, as gifts, as His signs. So our understanding of the way we deal not only with, look at this, in human rights the people are saying, you know what, that's my body, I do whatever I want. In Islam you don't start like this, never. Your body, it's your body, it's not. Even your body, even your mind, even yourself, you don't start like this. You have a responsibility towards your body. So in fact, the way you deal with your own health is based on al-Khilafah. Not the way it was put by Daesh and all this in political terms, is the philosophical essence of Allahu la ilaha illa. Your understanding. So it's not a secondary issue to talk about the source when you talk about human rights. It's on this, we are integrating from the very beginning the first question of Gandhi, and we respond to Gandhi, your mother was right. We start with duties. We start with this. So that's an important thing because al-Khilafah here, and with this responsibility, with this understanding that we have duties, what we understand coming from God, and this is something that cannot be discussed by all means, and this is where we, wherever we are today, we should be the voice of this. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We give dignity to human beings, mean to all human beings. And by no standards, no way we can accept that my citizens are better than other citizens or migrants and refugees, or my people as Muslims are better than others. By definition, I have a duty towards humanity. We have the same dignity. Period. So that's changing the whole narrative. We start with the duties. You have to respect that's a duty. Don't come and tell me my human rights. My duty is to do that. Get this right, because it's a mindset that you have. In Islam, you start to think about the poor not out of nice thoughts. Zakat. Zakat. This is a duty that you have towards them. So the whole mindset here is to understand that Tawheed is to change the whole picture and to understand we have to this. So the first notion that we have is al-Karama here. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. There is also something which is important in the al-Karama, which is also what some of the scholars who are coming, al-Karama is based on what? There are two things that are important. If you are talking about al-Mas'uliyah is what is making you فَضَّلْنَاكُمْ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ, that you have a greater responsibility to serve. You have to acknowledge two things which are important: freedom and knowledge. Freedom, it's important. Why? Because my dignity is in my freedom, that I can choose. To the point that the whole discourse that we have about men and angels is based on the fact that human beings can choose. But you have this, al-hurriya, al-mas'uliyya, and then knowledge, that you need to have an informed decision. So there is no real freedom without knowledge. So these four principles, in the way you look at them, you have a duty towards Allah, and as soon as you start the duty with Allah, you understand that any society which is not providing human beings with the protection of their dignity, the protection of their freedom, their knowledge, and their responsibility. So to be able to be responsible, this is why coming from the hadith also, that at one point, al-faqr, poverty, قد يؤدي إلى الكفر, could push the people towards not believing in them, because we are acting against the essence of humanity by pushing towards poverty. So here there is something which is, we start the whole discussion with human rights with the big picture and saying, where are we in this? We start with understanding our duties towards the owner, al-khaliq, within al-khalq, in the creation. And this is where we have the four principles. Now what we have coming from this discussion about al-maqasid is very often when we speak about human rights, and this was Salman al-Awda or Bani Sadr in the Shia tradition, are very often saying, oh, you know, what we have in Islam is hifz al-nafs, so it's about human integrity, so everything is there, so it would be enough to deal with this, to have the whole understanding of the human rights. I think that this is problematic. It's too wide to be efficient. So the problem here is, in the name of inclusiveness, we are missing efficiency. Get my point? We are so inclusive that it's not efficient. Hifz al-nafs, you protect integrity, human integrity and the people, and that's enough. No, we have to put this, al-maqsid, and the higher objective, even though some of the scholars were saying it's beyond the daruriyat, or we have the three. I don't care. The whole philosophy, the whole understanding of the objective should be based on this understanding at the beginning. It's in fact the big picture at the beginning should be translated into what are the objectives. What are the objectives when it comes, for example, any society, which means should promote the sense of the duty towards the Creator, based on, as conditions, freedom. First, dignity, freedom, knowledge, and then responsibility. So if you look at the way you have to organize the whole thing, based on this big picture at the beginning, starting with al-khilafa, with our responsibility towards God, you come to this and say, what are the main objectives on which you have to work if you want to promote human rights, based and understood in the light of our duties towards God? First, it has to do with dignity. Second, it has to do with education. Third, it has to do with freedom. And then with responsibility. All our ethical structure is based on what we are going to put at the beginning. Now, if you want to enter into the discussion in the West and say, you know what, let us show that we don't have a problem with the human rights, and you don't get that there is a problem with the human rights the way they are working today. We have a problem. It's not, there is no, it's not, how do you say this? I don't even have in any language I don't have the word. Contraignant. Contraignant. It's not compulsory. No, it's not exactly compulsory. No. Contraignant, it's more subtle than that. Contraignant, learn French. I don't have time. Contraignant, okay? So it cannot be, it cannot be imposed in a way, it cannot be, it's not binding. Exactly, it's not binding. MashaAllah. علوم إسلامية لغات جزاك الله خير. Binding, okay? You got that? Contraignant, binding. You have a French word now in your vocabulary. So it's not binding by the fact that, yes, you say, okay, we respect this, but at the end, you protect the rights, but if not? What if you behave against? Is it going to have an impact on a nation or on a collectivity or a community. It's not. So here, what I wanted to say here, it's we can go and try just to show that there is no problem, or to be critical towards what is happening. What I was saying is not binding. And the second thing which is important is the mindset and the culture that it's promoting with this culture of rights, which I would say it's one of the most, or it's the deeper psychological problems we have in our democracies. How do we change this culture of rights into, commitment towards the community, understood as duties, obligations? So from an Islamic perspective, we have this when it comes to the very deep, and this is why I liked what Muhammad Iqbal was saying when he was coming from a spiritual background, speaking even about spiritual democracy, in the way he was understanding that our spirituality is adding to our citizenship a sense of responsibility towards him and towards human beings. That's essential. That's essential. Bring some spirituality in the human rights business. With what I'm saying at the beginning. Duties, connecting, liberation, not rights. Liberation from my ego to know my duties in order to get my rights, not the other way around. Claiming my rights, forgetting my duties, and being happy with my ego. You see how it can be transformed. So this is where the whole mindset in the human rights discussion could be distorted if we don't start with the right thing. That's exactly where I would like us to be critical on both. Why? Because what we have here is that we have to add more than this. And based on this, this is why I think it's too wide. From Hifz and Nas, we have to come to something which is much more specific. What we need to promote in the name of these four notions that I mentioned here, and you can find them in a way in Radical Reform, which I think that this is the part of the book which is not studied and understood by many. They don't get what I'm trying to say. It's just some are reducing the book to bring the scholars of the text and the context and make them talk. That's not the point. It's deeper than that in the critique of the methodologies that we have. What I would say with the four notions is that there is here something which we are bringing what the Latin American critique by saying, look, any society which is not giving the human beings what could help them to achieve the four dimensions, dignity, education, freedom, and responsibility, is acting against human rights. So it's the duty of the community to protect the rights of each. So duty first, again, but not one versus one, collective versus one. Meaning what? We can't start any discussion in Islam if you don't get this. And this is why the whole liberation process in Islam started with, you are with God, look at the poor. All the first verses revealed are about this. كَلَّا بَلْ لَا تُكْرِمُونَ الْيَتِيمِ مِنْ كَرَامَةِ الْإِنسَانِ. You don't give and you don't acknowledge the dignity of the poor. So it starts with this duty that you have. You are with him, know your duty towards them. So it's a collective duty to respect the human rights, basic needs. Food, drink, house, education. So we reverse the whole thing. But we don't disconnect the community from the single. Why? Because this fragmentation and to come with the individuals has an impact at the end. What you see today is the impact of the whole construction. Let us come with our common rationality and we build everything. And at the end that you see that something is missing. This was the sense the Native Americans and the First Nations had when they came to them. There's something which is wrong in the whole mindset. And this is why we have to be critical, but not to critique in an arrogant way. Because we have a lot to learn, in fact. I'm learning a lot with all these texts, because many people were very sincere and very deep in what they were trying to do. So it's a collective, critical, and positive contribution. No rejection, no arrogance. Because it's serious. I take human rights very seriously. All what I'm saying here is not just to dismiss the point, it's to, at what point are you adding something to it? and making it serious in the way we deal with it. Because many Muslim majority countries have a problem with human rights, of course. And we know that we are much more, we are better treated in many Muslim Western countries than in Muslim majority countries, as our dignity. Even about the first point, our education, or distorting the education of so many as a collective failure. That's the reality. So having said that, I would say that this is where we need to add to this and start with the basic education and all this as objective, as maqasid. So once again, in this field, there is no way, if we carry on repeating the five and saying there are some daruriyat, we don't have a frame, we don't have a vision, we are not going to make it. We are not contributing to the discussion. We are adding to please or rejecting to protect. So this is us today. Adding to please and rejecting to protect. We reject the human rights to protect ourselves, or adding just because we Muslims, we don't have a problem with it. But it's not a contribution. It's not a deep contribution to the discussion. Now, we have a mirroring contradiction on this. Is that even in the way we were dealing with the maqasid, from the legal to the objectives and the way it was constructed, very often we were thinking here about, so what I was saying about the West is it's about the individuals and the rights. In the Islamic tradition, it's the mirroring contradiction is very much about the duties that we have. And very often, even in the maqasidi thing, we can have haqq al-ibad or haqq Allah, but very often we turn the thing and we don't speak about the right, we speak about the duty that they have on you. But there is something which is missing in our discourse as Muslims. So can we, from all what I'm saying, produce also a balanced culture of rights and duties? Not only duties. Not only talk about you in order to know what are your rights on me, but what are my rights within the society. So the balanced reality. What we have in the West is a culture of rights. What we had in the Islamic tradition, very often, except for some specific things that were produced in fiqh, it's a culture of duties. And it's mirroring. And the problem is that we need to find a way here which is based on what I'm trying to do in the big picture. I don't know if you follow what I'm saying. Are you following? Okay, hope so. So, and this is where, if we look at this mirroring contradiction or reduction that we have from the duties and on one side and from the rights on the other, integrating this into an overall philosophy and understanding of al-tawheed, al-khilafa, wal-mas'uliyya, all what we have, which is once again based on the way even we have to deal with ethics. And I agree on the Sheikh Draz in his book about the way he was constructing and responding to the West by saying in which way we start our ethical thing with the obligation and then also the obligation connected to freedom, because the obligation should be relying on freedom and responsibility. And then to go from the rules, and this is where to go from the rules with our understanding, the way the maqasid were thought, we need to go beyond that and to integrate what I was saying about this big picture and be quite clear about the fact that there will be no real contribution if we don't bring them together, and to think about some of the essential things that we need to tackle. And this was a discussion that we had the day before yesterday when it comes to objectives of justice, for example. In Islam, justice is not something which is collective. It's also something which is individual. To be just is a duty that you have towards your own self. So there is something which is spiritual in justice, in the relationship that you have with God, in the relationship that you have with your fellow human beings. The same when it comes to, and once again, the fact, the whole philosophy that we have behind zakat, which is a duty that you have towards the poor, saying justice is not going, or social justice is not going only coming out of your free will, It's not only sadaqah, it's something which is deeper than that. So from this rule, you can build something which is very important in the human rights, in the way you deal with the poor. A philosophy, the liberation theology in Latin America. In fact, they were having a problem with the Catholic Church, and they were saying, you know what, we have to reread our scriptural sources through the eyes of the poor people. Okay, and we look at justice from the eye of the poor people, because what was saying what? We don't read the text the same way, depending on where we are in the social reality. And they're right. In Islam, it's true that we have scholars, the way they deal with poverty, the way they even deal with rights, it's quite clear that we can see from where they talk. And I can tell you that many of the scholars who are now dealing with Islamic finance, they're not dealing with poor people. They are not. Many of them, they don't care. It's not there. So this is where my question here when it comes to our human rights, do we have to start with reading the Quran with the eyes of the poor, or do we have to read the Quran from this overall understanding? What does it mean? El-Tawheed, El-Khilafa, and then our connection to God. It's the whole dimension which has to be different. Not to put ourselves in a very specific situation, but to reconcile ourselves with this big picture, which I think it's essential here. And I would say that the true liberation, and this is where I don't agree with the Christian liberation theology saying we start with the poor, I think that we have to start with the spiritual liberation, which has an impact on everything else. Everything else. But the spiritual liberation is what I said. Tawheed, Khilafa, wa Mas'uliyya. Then you start the whole thing. You don't say, put myself as reading the world as a poor. No. Reading the world as a Khalifa, min al-Khulafa, that understand who is the owner, what do I have to do, and understanding my duties before just nurturing a culture of rights. And human rights are to be integrated, merging with our understanding of our duties towards towards whom. What I said in the public lecture is the 4 dimensions, the 5 dimensions: the self, the individual, the social, the international, and nature, the environmental. These are the 5, and this is where the maqasid are coming. So tell me, do you have human rights towards yourself? Can you understand the power of this discourse when you come to say, I have a discourse, I have something to say about human rights, about myself alone, my spirituality, my freedom. Why? Because the freedom you are talking about is a superficial freedom. It's a freedom that you can buy and that you can sell, that you can manipulate with all your products. My freedom is not there. I have a human rights towards my heart, not to be manipulated by what we call freedom, which is not true freedom. This is superficial freedom. You are telling me, think as you want to think, but I don't even know that if I'm thinking independently, because the power that you have is making me think the way you want me to think, to like what you want me to like. A human rights this is why we are talking about autonomy, about true freedom. So we start with a discussion on human rights. Let us talk about freedom first, and not the freedom you are talking about. It's not the right only to move, it's the right to be. Spiritual liberation. You get my point here, which is an added reality on what we call human rights here, which is deep. And I can tell you that we are not alone thinking like that. We are lots of people that can understand exactly what I'm saying here. Because this is, in fact, a universal challenge that we are facing. When it comes to the spiritual, the individual, the social also, at the end of the day, there is a big question. There is a big question about, for example, in our, you say, human rights, okay, as individuals. Do I have a right to family? And if you say, no, we have to reassess, what do you mean by family? Okay, but let us come to this discussion. Let us come to the discussion of the first social setting. How is it going to work? Do we have to say something about this? Or just are we going to say, you know what, in Islam, family is essential? Okay, shukran. Look at our community. Look at what is happening in Muslim majority society. we don't have something which is coming with a deep understanding of what is the duties and the rights within the society here. And I don't want to enter into the discussion on human rights only on the Universal Declaration superficially. It's deep here that we have to come with our contribution in this discussion. So as I said, 5 fields: the self, the individual, the social, the international, and the environmental. And then, last point, which is now not only to come with a critique of our own tradition and to produce something with a more efficient set of maqasid based on what I'm trying to say here, which also, again, it's the starting point of a reflection, but also a critique of what we have in the West. And our contribution, for the great majority of you, you live in the West, not all of you, but we all have to be involved in the discussion. It's a constructive critique of what we have as the culture of rights in our societies. So I would say that this is what we have to bring. Understanding that the culture, you know, I really want you to get that point, that the culture of rights is also very much in tune with the capitalist order. It's to define things at the surface of what is the free market, what is freedom, what is, you know, your freedom to consume and the consumerist and consumption. We don't come to the deep discussion. So as long as you have this superficial discussion on liberal values, human rights, and saying, you know what, we are going to ask you on 3 things. What is your take on marriage? What is your take on age? What is your take on homosexuality? And you keep on repeating on this, and you forget the whole picture. So it's very easy, you know, get me right, for rationalists, it's very easy to put believers in a difficult position. So at the end, it's not logic. Then you put your position and you keep on being on the defensive. Why are you on the defensive? But you enter into the logic and you end up responding to the equation because you didn't start by asking the deep question. So they take you to the superficial. You are caught in the superficial because you didn't start with the right. So you start in the wrong way, you end up being caught. Well, that's not my point. Don't talk about this. Let us come to the big questions that we have. Is it not this system producing all what we have now with injustices and lack of commitment towards humanity and all this? These are much more important things that we have to bring into the discussion. Once again, without, get me right, it's not because I want to start with the big picture that I am avoiding the controversial issues, but not in the way you put them, in the way we have to tackle them. Okay? So very often we start with the controversial and we forget the big picture. I would like with the big picture and integrate into the discussion the potential controversial issues. That could be a point as well. So, am I still in my time? At what time do I have to finish?
You have until 12:15.
To finish? Okay, no, mashallah, I'm good today. So what I was saying is that our critical contribution to the culture of rights, and this is why I think we have means from which we can start. For example, when it comes to what I was saying, the collective rights, and when I was saying the basic needs, if only we were to write something and to think about the whole philosophy of zakat, not in the way Sheikh Al-Qaradawi wrote his 2 books, which are interesting from a fiqh approach and very philosophical thing. It's not really a philosophical approach, it's a fiqh is zakat. But I really think that from this, to construct a deep understanding of our way of dealing with, for example, poverty and justice from an Islamic perspective, working on the rights of the poor within a collectivity and the duties that we have. This also would be something which is important. About education also. It's essential for us. But to make education not only an ideal, it's an objective that is necessary for us to respond to our duties and our rights at the same time. So to put this in this frame, not only, education is good and the political commitment is exactly the same. I don't like these scholars who are coming to us now telling us in the West or in Muslim majority countries it's wajib to vote. So giving us a fatwa on a political commitment that you have to vote, that it's an obligation. I had a discussion with Badawi, not Jamal Badawi, in the UK. What was his name? Badawi. You remember? What is the name? He passed away, rahimahullah. He came with a very strong statement. In Islamic terms, it's a wajib for you to vote. You have to vote and you can. And I think that this is very problematic, to make it a religious obligation. Still, I think it's very important to vote and we have to be involved. And sometimes we have to think about it twice. But there's also political commitment based on the culture of human rights that we are nurturing based on the principles. Exactly the same with the economic impact, understanding that we have to reconnect all that together. So it's the big picture, and then it's also reconnecting the economic impact, the political commitment, social dynamics with poverty and all this. My conclusion here is, once again, you can see that inductively I start upstream, and what I am saying is that we have to come back to a conception of God, a conception of human beings, because what I was talking about now, it's a concept of human beings. It's a conception of human beings. Before talking about human rights, tell me human. Who are the human you are talking about? We need a conception of human being, and very often we jump beyond this discussion and we don't talk about this. And in Islam we have this. We have a conception of human beings. And in fact, what I said now, conception of God, conception of human being, conception of death, and conception of life, what is it? What would you, which word are you using to tell me conception of God, conception of human being, conception of death, conception of life? From an Islamic perspective. It's a consequence. Sharia. 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 Sharia is wide. And it's all this. Sharia, it's not the legal only. It's, and it's not, you know, my father, I got this in my, rahimahullah, that's what I got from my Islamic culture, and at home he was always saying a way of life, a way of life. And I repeated this because I was convinced. And then I started dealing with this and saying it's even more than that. A way of life is a consequence of conception of God, conception of human being, conception of death, and conception of life. Which we have to start this discussion about human rights from there. So anyone who is starting the discussion by telling you remove Sharia from your vocabulary, and you end up thinking it's on the legal, you are in trouble. It's not the point. The point is to come back to the deep understanding of what we are talking about. Sharia, it's a conception of God and it's a conception of human beings. And it has to do with life and death. That's what we are bringing into the discussion. And what I was saying in the discussion that we had with Shawqi about, you know, being respectful towards what we have to say, I think that our discussion, and especially in this field, is always out of mutual respect with all the traditions, all the people who are working on human rights, to start with, are not people who are, you know, coming with the colonization and not, that's not true. We have to be cautious that some are instrumentalizing these legal instruments. But many, I saw so many people sincere and doing much more than what we are doing on the ground, coming from all the religious traditions and with no religions. So the starting point in this discussion is in a positive, constructive way to enter into the discussion. And I can tell you that if you start with this by saying, you know, I have some question about the way we are framing it, the people are listening. They are listening. Our contribution is going to be heard if we come with this, which is respecting this and understanding. We might come to it from another route, from another understanding. And then we question questions that we have in common about freedom, about responsibility, about duties that we have towards the collectivity, this culture of rights that is undermining the very essence of the democratic process. If you end up thinking that as citizens you have only rights and you don't get the duty towards humanity, this is exactly what is happening. So my rights is to protect my rights within a nation. I can, be sad when my people are killed, and you don't understand this huge dimension of duties and commitment towards humanity and the common humanity. This is something that we can bring. But to bring this, we also have to feel it. And this is why I keep on repeating, as long as the Muslims, when it comes to human rights, and when it comes to rights, and when it comes to oppression, they only care about Muslims being oppressed and don't care about human beings being oppressed, there is a problem. So you are preaching exactly the opposite of what the essence of what we are talking about. We do not make a difference between the oppressed people. In the name of this, in the name of Karamat al-Insan. We don't. So we have to be the voice for everybody, everywhere. And to be able just, I see so many Western Muslims, they want so much to be perceived as citizens that they are not ready to have a critical thinking about what is coming from the global south, or the refugees or the migrants. I think that this is a problem. And as I said, a balanced approach at the meta level, which once again is meta level, is metaphysical. It's there. And then you come with this. And you integrate into this all what we were saying about al-maqasid. And I would say that this is essential in our discussion. And one last point, I would say, is how can we translate this into very practical engagement? Because it's very important to connect this vision, the big picture, the comprehensive approach, but we need to be very practical in the way. So for example, I think that we need a very clear philosophy of implementing zakat in our societies today. When it comes to justice and education, a very, very powerful discourse on the duty towards education and the rights to education. So we have fields here where it's very important. For example, the common dignity, a very strong discourse about the fact that citizenship is great, humanity is greater. These are powerful statements but once again, not to please the West, but to be consistent with ourselves. And to be serious, for example, about racism. The duty towards, it's a duty to struggle against our own potential racist statements. And you cannot deny that it's there. If the Quran is talking about this by saying these are signs of God, if these are signs of what He wants, it means that we might end up projecting this and taking it as, and this is what we are doing. Is there an Islamic discourse? Exactly the opposite. I don't know why after 3 generations, and even in Muslim majority countries, we still have racist attitudes that are unacceptable. Unacceptable towards the black, towards the migrants, towards the refugees, towards the poor. And we want to teach the world, or to lecture the world about the great. So why I'm saying this? Because what I'm saying, you all say yes, yes, but at one point, can we make this a practical commitment where we are? That is say, okay, this is where we start with our comprehensive understanding of what are the human rights that we are. It's based on the duties and everything else. So this kind of a sense of responsibility, which is the very meaning of al-khilafah on earth, which is to bear witness once again. Wallahu a'lam wa a'la wa ahkam. Thank you.